I'm guessing I'm live. I really don't like this whole situation. Like, I really don't. It it is what it is because we're not here today to talk about my skin. We are here today to talk about white privilege. So, I saw this video on YouTube a few days ago, and this guy was like talking about how he did not have white privilege because he grew up poor. And I was thinking, that is not how privilege works. But so I started typing a comment to like reply to this guy, but the comment ended up being so long that I was like, oh, I might as well turn it into an article. And then I started turning it into an article, and then that ended up being really long as well. So I'm now in the process of breaking that article up into little pieces. But in the meanwhile, I did want to get some of this information out here. So that's why I decided to do this live stream. So, this is for people who are having a hard time, who understand what white privilege is, but are having a hard time explaining it to others and making it clear as to why it matters. So, I came up with this case study. And this case study is based off of Boomer. Let's call him Average Joe. Let's do that. And I'm going to read you the case study and then we'll break it down a little bit. Okay. So let's say that Joe's great grandparents came to this country in 1890. They never owned slaves. They were poor and they had to live in Appalachia. Uh, his great grandfather worked in a coal mine for 30 years. He died of black lung disease. They had 9 kids in a 1 bedroom house. All of the boys worked for the coal mine, and the only one who made it to adulthood was Joe's grandpa. So, as soon as he was old enough, Joe's grandpa signed up for the military. He served in World War I, but he never made it home. Joe's grandmother was a widow with 5 kids. She had a small vegetable garden and did laundry on the side a few extra dollars. That's the second generation. Okay, now Joe's dad grew up in a fatherless home with a mother who could barely keep food on the table. As soon as Joe's dad got old enough, he enlisted in the military. He served in World War II and he came back home a war hero. He moved to a suburb in Pennsylvania where he met Joe's mom, who worked in an ice cream shop. They got married and bought a 1 bedroom shotgun house. Joe's dad worked for the steel mills, and Joe's mom eventually went to nursing school. They had 5 kids. Joe is the oldest. There was never enough money to go around when Joe was little, so when he turned 12, he got a paper route. There wasn't a lot of money, but there was a lot of love. By the time Joe graduated from high school in the 1960s, Joe's parents had finally saved enough to buy a better house in a nicer neighborhood. Joe's siblings benefited from this, but Joe did not because Joe was already grown. So then Joe met a nurse who reminded him of his mom in a completely non creepy, very good, healthy way, and they got married. Joe took a factory job and had 3 kids of his own. Him and his wife saved every penny for a decade, and they were finally able to buy a 4 bedroom house in 1970. Joe's oldest graduated in 1978 and immediately started working at the plant with Joe. Joe's youngest wanted to go to college, so Joe and his wife took out a loan on the house to make that happen. In 1990, Joe's youngest daughter graduated from med school. She married a pediatrician from Poughkeepsie and they moved to New York. Joe's grandkids went to private school, and by the time they graduated from high school, we had a black president. So, where was the privilege? Yes, Joe had one successful daughter, but Joe's oldest son drank himself to death when the plants closed, and Joe's middle child works as a bus driver. Joe is retired now, and he finally owns his own home free and clear because it took over a decade to pay back what he spent on his daughter's education. Joe has never gotten anything in life that he didn't work his ass off for. So he feels very strongly that there's no way he can have white privilege, right? Okay, so that's usually the kind of scenario I get when people are saying that they don't have white privilege. is that kind of like hard knock life history. And I think that we can all agree that Joe has lived a hard knock life and has done so for generations. But the thing about it is that even in this scenario, Joe still has privilege and is woven all in and through the story of his life, but it's invisible to him. So we're going to break some of that down. Let's start with Joe's great grandparents. They came to this country in 1890, but they came on their own volition. They weren't kidnapped from where they lived and brought here in chains. They settled on land that was stolen from Native Americans and made available to white people only. So if Joe's great grandfather hadn't been white, he wouldn't have been able to purchase that tiny scrap of land that he built that cramped little one bedroom house on. No amount of money would have made a landowner sell to Joe's great grandfather if he was black. The coal mine that Joe's great grandfather worked in, where they paid him less than enough to feed his family, the people around him were probably actually jealous because there was this thing in Appalachia, only like 3% of Appalachia could actually get a job in the coal mines. And that might not track for you. If you're pretty, solid on history, you might think, but it's coal country. So what do you mean only 3% of the people could actually work in the coal mines? Well, that's because coal companies weren't stupid and they were not going to pay people if they didn't have to. And they didn't have to. So mainly what they did was they purchased leased convicts from the federal government. So there was this practice called convict leasing, and basically it was designed to force Black people in the South into sharecropping, and that's a whole nother conversation. But I'm going to keep it real simple and say that people would get arrested for things like vagrancy, which was standing in public without proof of employment, or insolence, which was being uppity. And that meant they were convicted of a crime, which meant that they were subject to the 13th Amendment exemption. So they were actually allowed to be treated as slaves because they had been convicted of a crime. And that's what they did. They were sold to all these different coal companies, steel companies, the railroad, like pretty much every major institution, power and gas, like everything in this country was built off of slave labor that continued past the end of slavery. So for Joe's great grandfather, all that work that he was doing and not getting paid enough to live off of, there was probably a Black person standing next to him doing the exact same work who wasn't paid at all. Joe's great grandfather died of Black lung disease, but when he died, his family was allowed to have a funeral and bury him and have some form of closure. But when legally kidnapped Black coal miners died, their bodies were dumped in mass graves. The family never knew what happened to them because once they entered the convict leasing system, they were gone for good. So, I mean, there's all of these letters that these widows wrote to the president saying that their husband got picked up for vagrancy and they never seen him again. And it's just very sad. But suffice to say, working in a coal mine for very little money is not the same as working in a coal mine for no money. And working in the coal mine and dying of Black lung and your family having a funeral doesn't really feel like a privilege until you realize that there were other people who had that same coal mine experience and did not get the privilege of a funeral or the dignity. Their family didn't get that dignity or that sense of closure or anything. Okay, let's talk about Joe's grandpa. Joe's grandfather died. Oh, no, that's his great grandfather. Joe's grandfather. Okay, that's the World War I vet. He went to World War I. He died for his country. He was allowed to do that because when he enlisted in the military, he received training to fight and he was allowed to fight. Well, there were over 350,000 Black people that served in World War I, but the overwhelming majority of them were not trained to fight or allowed to fight. So Over 300,000 of those soldiers had to do menial tasks like building roads and digging trenches and latrines, loading and unloading ships and supplies, or cooking and cleaning for other soldiers. The few who were actually trained for combat, which was about 40,000 Black people, were trained for combat in World War I, and they had to train in segregated camps run by white officers. So many of the soldiers sent letters to their elected officials, their family members, and their local newspapers about the physical abuse that they endured at the hands of their white superiors. When Joe's grandfather signed up for war, he knew he might face death, but he had a reasonable expectation that that death would be at the hands of his enemies, not his fellow soldiers. If Joe's grandfather had been Black, he would not have been able to have that reasonable expectation. When Joe's grandfather died and left Joe's grandma a widow with 5 kids, Joe's grandma received a widow's pension from the U.S. government. The pension was $125 a month plus $20 per child per month. So for Joe's grandma, having 5 kids, that meant her pension check would have been about $205 a month. Now, that might not sound like a lot. And it's not, but it converts to $3,800 a month in today's money. Now, I'm not saying $3,800 a month is enough to feed a family of 5, because it isn't. It really is not, but it's different from nothing, right? Black widows were routinely denied their pensions. If Joe's grandma had been Black, the military could have just straight out denied her widow's pension, and there would have been nothing she could do about it, because who are you going to appeal to? Who are you going to tell? So, same situation. If Joe's grandmother had been Black, the military could have just flat out denied her pension, and that $3,800 a month wouldn't even be coming in, and so she would be in an even worse financial position. Now, Joe's dad. Joe's dad is a World War II vet. He fought for his country, and he earned veterans benefits like a pension, paid vocational training, medical and life insurance, hiring preferences, and home loans that were guaranteed through the GI Bill. He could move into any neighborhood that he could afford to live in, and all of those VA benefits were administered at a local level by white government employees. So if Joe's dad had been Black, whether or not he got any of the veterans benefits that he earned serving in World War II would have been up to Jim Crow era white people. So because of that, Black World War II soldiers were routinely denied access to their veterans benefits, most especially the GI loans. So even if they could afford it, Black soldiers were in white neighborhoods and told they could only purchase homes in segregated red line neighborhoods that were intentionally designed to depreciate. The suburb that Joe's dad bought a shotgun house in, he couldn't have lived there if he was Black. The ice cream shop that Joe's dad met his mom at, he wouldn't have been allowed inside that ice cream shop if he was Black. Joe's dad worked at the steel yard where he was part of a union. If he was Black, he wouldn't have been allowed to be a part of the union, because many of the labor unions didn't integrate until like the 70s, like the late 70s. Joe's mom went to nursing school. She was allowed to apply to any nursing school in the country. She wasn't guaranteed to get into any school, but she wasn't held back from applying. So if Joe's mom had been Black, she would have had a very limited list of schools that she was allowed to apply to. She still wouldn't have been guaranteed to get in, but she even if she was top of her class, she wouldn't have been guaranteed to get in, but she wouldn't have even had like as many options for applying, because she would have had to apply only to the nursing schools that accepted colored students, and there weren't a lot of them. Joe's mom would be a part of the nurses union, but if she was Black, whether or not she got to be a part of the nurses union would be up to her white coworkers. They would have to accept her in it. Joe started getting a job as a paperboy at 12, and that job probably paid him about $75 a month. But if he was Black, it would have paid about $45 a month. Joe was able to deliver white newspapers in white neighborhoods. Even if he never got a tip, he had a reasonable expectation that people in the neighborhoods that he was delivering papers to were not going to kill him while he was doing his job. But if Joe had been black, he wouldn't have had that expectation. Even if a white newspaper would have hired him, it still would be unsafe for him to do the job. So if Joe was black, he would have had to work for a colored newspaper delivering in colored neighborhoods. And that's if the city even had a colored newspaper, because a lot of cities did not. Joe's parents saved every penny and were able to buy a better house, but every dollar that Joe's dad made as a white man would have been 60 cents if he was a black man. It took Joe's family 15 years of savings to have enough money to buy the house. But if that family was black, that same family, it would have taken them 24 years to save the same amount. The better house Joe's parents bought in the 60s probably cost around 12 grand, which is the equivalent of $100,000 in today's money. But once the family had the money, they were automatically allowed to buy whatever house they could afford. Now, if Joe's parents were black, they would have either had to buy a house in a red line neighborhood, which again was designed to depreciate, or take a chance on contract lending in a white neighborhood. So contract lending was this thing that basically you didn't accrue any equity in your house until the house was totally paid off. So you could be making payments on your house for like 5 years and miss one payment, and your landlord could evict you just like if you were renting and you had no equity in that house. They also had these things called housing covenants, which was, the neighborhood had to take a vote on who could move into the neighborhood. Some neighborhoods were incorporated with covenants that said, we don't want black people or Jewish people living in here. And this was like actually on the books. So with that, if Joe's parents were black, they would have had to either buy a house in a red line neighborhood or take a chance on contract lending. They could only move into the neighborhood if their white future neighbors voted to allow them to do so. And this would have been civil rights era white people that had to vote yes for a black family to be able to move in. So even if the neighbors did vote yes, somebody was probably going to throw a brick through his porch window or leave a steaming turd on his doorstep just to remind him of his place. The high school Joe went to, segregated. The better high school Joe's siblings went to, segregated. If Joe was black, he would have had less teachers, bigger class sizes, older textbooks, and crappy school infrastructure. In the winter, it might have snowed in his class. If his school was far away, he could take a school bus or ride the city bus to get there. But if Joe was black, there wasn't going to be a school bus for him. He was walking. And if Joe took the city bus, he most likely had to walk outside of his neighborhood to find a bus stop, because there weren't a lot of bus stops in black neighborhoods, even though a lot of black people took the bus. The nurse Joe fell in love with would have had the same invisible advantages that his mother had as a nurse: access to schooling, access to unions, and higher pay rates. Wherever Joe met his wife, he probably wouldn't have been allowed to be in that space if he was black. And if Joe was white and fell in love with a black woman, he wouldn't have legally been allowed to marry his wife until after 1967. And even when he did get married, their 3 kids would be Negroes because their mother was black. They would have to go to segregated schools. The 4-bedroom house that Joe bought in 1970 would have to be in a red line neighborhood that was designed to depreciate. Saving every penny for a decade, that would have taken Joe 16 years if he was black. The loan he took out so that his daughter could go to college, he wouldn't have been able to do that if he was black, because the house that he bought in 1970 would have depreciated instead of appreciating. So you have no equity in your house. No equity means no loan. No loan means no med school for your little girl. The med school Joe's daughter went to, over 90% of her classmates were white. So if Joe's daughter had been black, about 1 in 10 of her classmates would look like her. If Joe's daughter was white, most of her professors looked like her. If Joe's daughter was black, not so much. And this matters. It might not seem like it matters, but this does matter, because let's just say Joe's daughter was black. and having this experience. 90% of her classmates don't understand white privilege. So they don't understand how many obstacles she's had to overcome just to be in the space she's at. And they don't understand the emotional and psychological toll of having to explain and justify your lived experience every day, and then have people tell you that you're making it up or that they don't believe you. In med school, Joe's daughter would have learned that Black people have less nerve endings and a higher pain tolerance because hundreds of years ago, white doctors operated on Black people without using anesthesia, and we survived it. So if Joe's daughter was Black, she probably would know that that wasn't true. But if she's white, she probably wouldn't. She was taught in med school that Black people lie about their pain in order to get drugs. Since she graduated in 1990 before the Human Genome Project was complete, Joe's daughter was taught that race is a biological reality, a concept that has since been proven false. She was taught that Black people's health problems were rooted in poor personal choices and biology, when in actuality, they were a result of generations of social inequality. Now, let's look at this. Joe's daughter makes 50 grand more a year than a Black doctor with the same training doing the same job. Joe married another doctor. Joe's daughter married another doctor. So Joe's son-in-law also makes 50 grand more per year than a Black pediatrician doing the same job. So together, the two of them make 100 grand more a year than a Black couple who had the same jobs would make. And because of that extra 100 grand, Joe's grandkids can now afford to go to private school. Generations of real estate steering mean that Joe, his kids, his grandkids don't live around any Black people. So Joe's family might not have any Black friends, but they didn't do it on purpose, right? But something was done and it was very intentional. And now, decades later, it looks like it was accidental, but this was actually intentional and planned out that way. Because Joe has lived around people that look and think like him for all his life, he has a very low threshold for having his perspective challenged. And so do his kids, and so do his grandkids. And because Joe's perspective has continually gone unchallenged, he feels fully justified in saying, I'm poor, so I can't have white privilege, when privilege is woven into every inch of his story and imprinted on his skin. So I guess basically what I'm saying is, if you're poor and white, you have white privilege. If you're gay and white, you have white privilege. If you're disabled and white, you have white privilege. If you're transgender and white, you have white privilege. If you're Muslim and white, you have white privilege. If you look white, you have white privilege. No matter how rocky your road was or how many roadblocks were thrown in your way, your skin color was not one of those roadblocks. And so that's what white privilege is. It just means that your skin tone is not going to count against you as you move through the world. I hope this made sense. I know this is a really extended example. I can do other examples. Like, you can literally tell me any situation as a white person that you grew up in, your grandparents, your great grandparents, and I will show you the privilege. I can pull it out. I can show you the privilege. So if you want to know, I guess just drop comments, or also follow my channel, Asia's Right. I do some explainers on different stuff. I'm trying to do more explainers. I'm going to figure out something so I don't look like this on camera, because I'm really not feeling it. So hopefully next time y'all see me, I'll look a bit more polished. But in the meanwhile, white people, don't feel guilty about being white, because that's not what this is about. You cannot change the fact that you're white. Just open your eyes, I guess, and be aware that everyone is not having the same lived experience that you have. And so what you consider normal might not be normal for everybody. What you consider universal might not be universal for everybody. And I think that's really hard for white people to do, because society centers them so much. And everything in society just tells you you're the norm, you're the norm, you're the norm. But in all actuality, everybody is not having the same experience in America as white Americans are having. So thank you for this. And I'll try going live again one day. And Yeah, stay woke.